A long time ago, in the year 950, in a cold part of Norway called Scandinavia, the freezing wind blew through the tall mountains and deep fjords. A group of people stood in a circle around a big crackling fire. In the middle, a man was tied to a wooden pole. He wasn't being punished for stealing or hurting someone. His crime was that people thought he acted too much like a woman. Back then, the Vikings believed this was one of the worst things a man could be accused of. In a few moments, the man would be burned alive while everyone watched. For Vikings, being called unmanly was more shameful than almost anything else. But what did acting like a woman mean to them, and why did they think it was so bad? To find out, we have to look at what life was like in Viking times and why they cared so much about being tough and manly. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, the Nordic peoples developed one of the most rigidly patriarchal cultures in Europe. Viking society was built upon pillars of honor, courage, and above all, unquestionable masculinity. The concept of Eri was central to Viking masculine identity. This word didn't merely refer to men who showed romantic interest in other men, but to any behavior considered feminine or submissive. A warrior who fled from battle, a man who wept publicly, or someone who displayed excessive fear could be labeled as urgy. The accusation was so grave that it was listed in Norse laws as one of the most serious offenses, punishable by permanent exile or death. The Icelandic sagas, written between the 12th and 14th centuries, but based on much older oral traditions, are filled with references to the concept of energy and the brutal punishments reserved for those so classified. These narratives reveal a society obsessed with masculine purity, where any deviation from gender norms was seen as a threat to the fundamental social order. One of the most documented cases in the sagas is that of Bjorn the Coward, a minor Wyal who lived in the mountains of Norway in the year 922. Bjorn had earned his nickname after refusing to participate in a raid against Irish monasteries, claiming he preferred to stay home tending his sheep. This behavior was interpreted by the community as evidence of his air nature. Initially, Bjorn was merely ridiculed and socially isolated. Other men refused to drink with him in the communal hall. His own wives avoided him publicly, and young warriors made jokes about his femininity. But when he was seen weeping after the death of his favorite horse, a public display of emotion considered unacceptable for a man, the situation escalated dramatically. The local chieftain, Erikr the Bloody Axe, convened a tribal assembly, to formally judge Bjorn. For 3 days, witnesses recounted examples of Bjorn's unmanly behavior, his reluctance to fight, his tendency to resolve disputes through words, rather than violence, and his preference for domestic activities like weaving and cooking. The verdict was unanimous. Bjorn was guilty of the traditional sentence for such a crime was a terrible choice. Permanent exile, which meant a slow death from hunger and cold in the wilderness, or bloatery, a ritual sacrifice where the condemned was burned alive as an offering to the gods, purifying the community of his contaminating presence. Bjorn chose to face the fire. On the morning of the execution, he was taken to a sacred grove outside the village. A great pea was built using oak wood, considered especially appropriate for this type of purifying sacrifice. The entire community was present, men, women, and children, to witness the removal of this stain from their society. Before being tied to the stake, Bjorn was forced to wear women's clothing, a wool dress, and women's jewelry as an additional form of humiliation. This practice, documented in various sagas, served to visually reinforce the nature of his transgression. The condemned was literally transformed into what he had been accused of being. The flames were lit at sunset, a moment considered auspicious for this type of ritual. As the fire consumed Bjorn, the crowd chanted prayers asking the gods to accept this sacrifice and protect the community from future contamination by unmanly behavior. His death was seen not as punishment, but as religious and social necessity. Another well-documented case occurred in Iceland in the year 986. A farmer named Thorvald was accused of orgy by his own brother, Gunnar, after being discovered in a compromising situation with another man. But what makes this case particularly interesting is that it wasn't the sexual act itself that caused the greatest scandal. It was the fact that Thorvald had assumed the feminine role in the relationship. In the Viking mindset, relations between men were classified in complex ways. A man who dominated another sexually still maintained his masculinity, as he was exercising power and control. But the man who submitted, who received like a woman, was considered fundamentally corrupted and unworthy to live among honored warriors. Gunnar, motivated by both genuine moral indignation and interest in inheriting his brother's lands, presented formal accusations at the Althing, the Icelandic parliament. During the trial, he presented witnesses who reported seeing Thorvald assume feminine positions and behaviors during the act. Thorvald attempted to defend himself by arguing he had been forced, but this only worsened his situation. In Viking logic, a true man would prefer to die rather than submit sexually. His claim of coercion was interpreted as additional evidence of his cowardice and unmanly nature. The sentence was particularly cruel. Thorvald would face nid, a special form of sacrifice reserved for the worst cases of he would be buried alive in a specially dug pit with only his head above ground and then slowly covered with stones while still breathing. This method was considered appropriate because it denied the condemned an honorable death by iron or fire. Thorvald's execution occurred during the winter solstice in the year 987. Hundreds of people traveled from across Iceland to witness this rare event. The pit was dug in sacred ground and special runes were carved into the stones used to bury the victim, supposedly to prevent his contaminated spirit from returning to haunt the living. Historical sources also document cases where the accusation of Egi was used as a political weapon. In the year 1002, during a dispute over succession to the Danish throne, Jarl Magnus accused his rival Olaf of origi based on rumors about his private life. The accusation was so damaging that Olaf was forced to challenge Magnus to single combat to defend his honor. The duel, known as Holmgang, took place on a small island in the middle of a fjord. Hundreds of Danish nobles gathered to watch this confrontation that would decide not only a political dispute, but also a fundamental question about masculinity and honor. Olaf killed Magnus in combat, but the stain of the accusation was never completely removed from his reputation. Even after proving his courage in battle, Olaf continued to face whispers and insinuations about his masculinity. He compensated by becoming excessively aggressive in his military campaigns, ordering particularly brutal executions of prisoners and displaying extreme cruelty as a way to prove his masculinity to critics. The execution methods for men accused of varied among different Scandinavian regions, but all shared common elements of humiliation and ritual purification. In Sweden, it was common for the condemned to be dragged through the village tied behind a horse, his masculinity being literally dragged through the mud before the final execution. In Norway, some condemned men were forced to fight bears or wolves in an improvised arena. This practice, called durakam, gave the accused a theoretical chance to prove his masculinity by killing a dangerous beast, but in reality was merely an elaborate form of public execution. The most terrible of these rituals was the blood or blood eagle, reserved for the most extreme cases. The condemned had his ribs broken and pulled out from his back, creating a shape reminiscent of eagle wings. The lungs were then removed and salted while the victim was still alive. This procedure was considered the definitive sacrifice to the gods, ensuring that the contamination was completely removed from the community. Women could also be executed for inappropriate gender behavior, but the punishments were different. A woman who dressed as a man or who tried to assume masculine roles could be declared sonder, true, and burned as a witch. However, these executions were much less frequent, as masculine behavior in women was seen as less threatening to the social order. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, attitudes toward Eri began to change slowly. The Catholic Church, while also condemning homosexual relations, did not endorse the brutal ritual executions of the pagan Norse tradition. Gradually, punishments like exile or religious penance replaced automatic death. However, the transition wasn't smooth. Many rural communities continued practicing the ancient traditions well after official conversion to Christianity. The last documented case of execution occurred in Iceland in the year 1123, when a farmer was burned alive by his own family after being discovered in a relationship with another man. The legacy of this obsession with rigid masculinity continued shaping Scandinavian culture for centuries. Even today, traces of this mentality can be observed in Nordic ideals of masculinity, though obviously without the fatal consequences of the Viking period. The sagas that preserve these stories serve as dark reminders of how rigid gender concepts can lead to extreme violence and social injustice. They reveal a society where pressure to conform to specific gender roles was literally a matter of life and death. The men considered feminine by the Vikings faced some of the cruelest fates in medieval European history. Their brutal deaths served not only as individual punishment, but as terrible warnings to others who might question or deviate from rigidly defined masculinity norms. Today, these stories confront us with questions about identity, social conformity, and the dangers of systems that mercilessly punish any deviation from established norms. The screams of those men burned alive echo through the centuries as reminders that intolerance and social rigidity can lead to the worst aspects of human nature.